What happens when one of Australia's most beloved icons walks onto a daytime talk show expecting a relaxed chat and instead ends up in the middle of a fight he never imagined? Paul Hogan, the man who made the world fall for the charm of Crocodile Dundee, arrived on the set of The View for what everyone assumed would be a friendly conversation about his long career, his life back home in Australia, and maybe a few jokes about tossing shrimp on the Barbie. But what happened next was something no one in the studio could have predicted. A clash so intense that the audience gasped out loud, the hosts scrambled to keep control, and Hogan himself was pushed to a point that shocked everyone watching. The segment started smoothly. Whoopi Goldberg introduced Hogan with real warmth, praising his impact on film and his status as an international treasure. The crowd clapped enthusiastically as Hogan stepped on stage, flashing that familiar crooked smile that had charmed millions. He took his seat, shared a few greetings with the panel, and looked ready to settle into what he likely thought would be a pleasant walk down memory lane. Sonny Hostin began with the soft question about his early days in Australian television, and Hogan told a funny story about working on the Sydney Harbour Bridge before moving into TV work. The table laughed, the mood was light, and everything seemed perfectly in place. Then Sarah Haynes followed up by asking what inspired him to create the character of Crocodile Dundee, and Hogan leaned back comfortably, explaining how he wanted to show the world a part of Australia that was humorous, confident, and a little wild. But then Joy Behar spoke up, and her tone shifted almost instantly. Anyone paying attention could feel the atmosphere in the room change. She started by acknowledging his success, but quickly pivoted to long-standing criticisms aimed at Crocodile Dundee, especially about how Indigenous Australians were shown in the film and whether the movie relied too heavily on certain stereotypes. Hogan's smile slipped just slightly, but he stayed calm. He said the film had been made with affection and respect, that it was a comedy meant to celebrate Australian culture, not mock it, and that everyone involved had good intentions. But Behar didn't let up. She pushed harder, saying that good intentions didn't always lead to good results, and asked if, looking back, he saw things differently. Hogan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. He said he stood by his work, that the movie had been embraced by audiences all over the world, including Australians, and he wasn't going to apologize for trying to make people feel happy. The other hosts seemed to feel the tension rising. Whoopi tried steering the talk toward his other projects, bringing up his famous tourism ads for Australia. But Behar cut in again. This time she brought up his old tax issues with the Australian Taxation Office, framing it as a question about responsibility. The change in topic was abrupt. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Hogan's entire demeanor changed. His laid-back charm was replaced by something more serious. He looked right at Behar and said in a calm but firm tone that those issues had been settled long ago, that he had been cleared, and that bringing it up now felt less like journalism and more like a personal hit. Behar insisted she was only asking questions people wanted answers to, saying public figures needed to be held accountable for their words and actions. Hogan leaned forward slightly, his voice still controlled but sharper, and said accountability went both ways. If she wanted to talk about responsibility, maybe they should talk about the responsibility of interviewers to show basic respect instead of ambushing guests on live TV. The room went silent. The hosts exchanged uncertain looks. Behar, refusing to step back, said if he couldn't handle tough questions, maybe he shouldn't have agreed to come on the show. Hogan let out a laugh with no humor in it. He said he had no issue with tough questions, but there was a difference between tough and hostile, between holding someone accountable and grinding an axe. Whoopi tried again to shift things to something lighter, maybe his family or what his life looked like now. Hogan nodded at her effort, but his eyes stayed locked on Behar, and it was clear he wasn't finished. Behar made one more comment, suggesting that celebrities often act like victims when confronted with uncomfortable truths. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Hogan's face grew red and his voice rose for the first time. He said he had spent his entire career being honest, making people laugh, sharing his culture with the world, and he wasn't going to sit there and be lectured by someone who seemed more interested in scoring points than having a real conversation. The crowd reacted loudly as some gasped, some clapped, others just stared. Sonny tried to join in but stopped mid-sentence. Sarah looked down at her cards. Whoopi looked like someone watching a slow-moving disaster. Behar, now looking annoyed, said Hogan was proving her point that he couldn't handle criticism, that he was too used to being admired. Hogan leaned forward, not standing but shifting closer, and said he had been challenged all his life, that he had worked harder than most people could imagine, and being challenged was one thing, but being disrespected was another, and he wasn't going to accept it. Whitby stepped in again, trying to control the situation, telling both of them to take a step back. She reminded them they were on television, and that things didn't need to get personal. Hogan nodded but said civility required everyone to participate, and so far he felt he was the only one doing so. Beher shot back immediately, saying it was interesting how men often accuse women of being uncivil when they were just being direct. Hogan looked stunned, letting out a short, shocked breath. He said this had nothing to do with gender and that he had been interviewed by many women who asked far tougher questions, and he never had an issue because those conversations were done with fairness and respect. He said the difference here was intent. He could tell she wasn't trying to understand him. She was trying to create conflict. The accusation hung in the air. Beher's face hardened. She said she didn't create conflict, and if there was conflict, it was because he brought it with him. Hogan shook his head and said he arrived ready to talk about his life and work, and instead he found himself being treated like he was on trial. Sonny tried to mediate, suggesting maybe they were misunderstanding each other. Hogan said there was no misunderstanding. He understood perfectly what was happening, and he knew when someone had an agenda. He said he had no problem being challenged about anything he'd actually done, but he did have a problem with being misrepresented. Beher demanded specifics. Hogan didn't hesitate. He said bringing up his tax situation like it was an unresolved scandal was misleading. He added that acting like Crocodile Dundee was some kind of harmful movie was also misleading, because the film had been loved for decades and helped open doors for Australian cinema. Beher argued that popularity didn't make something immune to criticism. Hogan agreed that culture changed over time, but he said there was a difference between real discussion and performative outrage, between honest critique and trying to appear virtuous. The words virtue signaling hit the room like a bomb. The audience reacted loudly. The hosts all started talking at once. Beher raised her voice above everyone, demanding to know if he was accusing her of virtue signaling. Hogan said he was calling it exactly how it looked. He could tell when someone cared about the topic and when someone only wanted to look good for viewers. Sora tried desperately to move to another subject, maybe his upcoming work, but Hogan wasn't finished. He said he wanted to complete this conversation because he believed it mattered. He said he chose to come on the show because he respected the platform, but now he was reconsidering that. Beher said if he was uncomfortable with honest conversations, that was his issue. Hogan said calling someone defensive when they're pointing out unfair treatment was just another tactic to dismiss their concerns. The debate became even more heated. Beher accused Hogan of refusing to accept that times had changed. Hogan shot back that he had never avoided accountability. He said he had spent years working with Indigenous Australians, using his platform to support Australian culture, and giving opportunities to others. Reducing his career to a handful of controversies, he said, was insulting to everyone who worked with him. Beher countered that legacy was complicated and mistakes didn't erase accomplishments. Hogan said he agreed completely, but he wouldn't apologize for things that weren't mistakes. He said Crocodile Dundee was a film made with heart, and he wouldn't let anyone rewrite its history just because it was now fashionable to criticize old movies. Beher argued that people who felt harmed by the film had valid feelings. Hogan said he understood that impact and intention could differ, but judging a decades-old film by standards that didn't exist then was unfair. He said they had consulted people, tried to be respectful, and made a movie that the majority of Australians, including Indigenous communities, enjoyed. Beher seized on his conditional apology, saying he was basically saying sorry if people were offended. Hogan snapped, saying she was twisting his words, which was exactly why he felt ambushed. He said he respected people's viewpoints, but that didn't automatically make every criticism correct. He said he poured his heart into that film, that it was meant as a love letter to his country, and having someone who had never walked in his shoes judging him by modern checklists made him furious. Sonny tried again to calm things down, saying maybe both sides cared deeply about these issues. Hogan said he could accept that they both cared, but caring didn't give anyone the right to misrepresent another person's work. Beher argued she hadn't misrepresented anything as she only asked questions others had raised. Hogan said calling his reactions being threatened was just another manipulation meant to invalidate his feelings. Whitby stepped in once more and asked Hogan what he wished people better understood about his work. Hogan said he wished people knew that Crocodile Dundee was made by a working-class guy who caught a lucky break, someone who wanted to show the world the light-hearted and adventurous side of Australia. It wasn't meant to be a documentary or a perfect representation of every part of Australian society. It was meant purely to entertain, and by that measure, it succeeded more than anyone dreamed. He said the film put Australian cinema on the map, helped many others in the industry, and its legacy was overwhelmingly positive. If people wanted to discuss certain parts of the film, that was fine, but rewriting its whole legacy wasn't. Beher jumped back in, insisting that pride didn't make art immune to criticism, and that his reactions showed he wasn't as confident in his legacy as he claimed. Hogan finally lost what little composure he had left a broken bar.